And they show time and time again how a sense of meaning helps us to cope precisely with those limitations that we're then confronted with. It helps you to cope with death. It helps us to cope with the limitation of our body. It gives us a meaning, a purpose to get through.
Welcome to Gen X Mindscape, the podcast dedicated to exploring the complexities of midlife and the pursuit of a purposeful life. I'm your host, Kyle, here to accompany you on this journey. I'm really excited you've joined me for this enlightening conversation with Dr. Joel Vos. I think my passion for podcasting really comes from the opportunity to talk with people who have immersed themselves in really profound questions and aspects of our existence. And Joel exemplifies this dedication beautifully. As you'll hear, he embarked on his quest to understand purpose and meaning from an early age, a journey that includes extensive scientific research and rich personal experiences. And what makes our conversation especially compelling is that Joel, like many of us, is currently navigating midlife, applying decades of accumulated wisdom to these uniquely midlife challenges. In the first part of our conversation, we delve into the fascinating history of how people have pursued meaning in their lives and examine methods of meaning making that boost psychological well-being and satisfaction. Joel also gives us insightful perspectives on navigating existential challenges during midlife, allowing us to live with more authenticity and a renewed purpose. I'm really confident that this conversation will be both meaningful and enlightening to you as you navigate your own journey. So let's introduce our guest. Dr. Joel Vos is a psychologist and philosopher who works as a senior researcher and senior lecturer at the Metanoia Institute in London. He is known for his research on meaning in life, and he's published over 160 articles in peer-reviewed journals and books. He has also graciously shared much of his work on his website, joelvos.com, which I highly recommend to those of you looking to learn more about him and his work. It was just a real pleasure getting to know him and talking with him. And so without further delay, here's my conversation with Dr. Joel Vos. And so welcome to the show, Joel.
Thank you very much.
Just really happy you're here. Could you start by giving us a little of your personal experience and how you got interested in today's topics?
Yeah, so I really enjoy that you've now invited me for this particular podcast about midlife, because I've never really reflected about how my life work, about research on meaning in life, how that actually relates to midlife. Not in this way. Of course, to some extent I have, of course, as a researcher, but to really focus on that, to really hone in. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
You're welcome.
What I also find important is always when we talk about meaning in life, it's not only theory, it's practice and get out of our head. So as preparation for our interview, I was reflecting on your questions actually for myself, because I'm at this moment also in the midlife, and I'm asking the same questions, like, where am I coming from? Where am I now? Where I'm going to? I've started to ask myself also the question for myself personally about what my own meaning in life is. Of course, I've been reflecting a lot on that during my full lifetime, and also as I'm a researcher, I'm a therapist, I'm a lecturer. I've written many books all about meaning in life. But it's not only theory. I've been reflecting on that myself. So I've been going back in my earliest memory. So possibly my first memory that I have. So I remember that I'm standing in front of my family. I've asked my family to sit on the sofa in front of me, and they were all surprised. They didn't know what I was going to do. And I did a book reading. And you would be like, fair enough, giving a book reading. There's nothing special about it. Well, I was 3 or 4 years old, and I had written my first own book. Of course, I couldn't write any letters yet. So it was all mere gibberish. So I invented my own letters.
Very cool.
And of course, I made a story. I made it up on the spot. But my family, they found it hilarious, of course. And they reinforced me to tell more stories, to write more of those kind of books with self-invented letters. Of course, very quickly, my parents started to also teach me how to write, because they could see that I was fascinated by how people write things. They tell stories, so of course I could see that is what all the grown-ups did. So I also wanted that. But so it's intriguing how writing then, at such an early age of possibly 3, 4 years, 5 years old, it already became my big sense of meaning in life. So I think it's quite rare. I've worked with thousands of people, and I've done research on possibly millions of people across the globe. And it's very rare that people already have a sense of meaning already in such an early age. But I think that I also can tell this story about my writing as a sense of meaning, because it also shows how very often as a child we already can have a spontaneous sense of meaning. Mm-hmm. And it's important to listen to those initial gut feelings and what we have. My story is also, when I reflect on my own life, I can also see how this sense of meaning has helped me through a lot of hardships. And that's what a lot of your listeners will also possibly also acknowledge in their own life, how in the darkest moments in your life, how a sense of meaning can pull you through. So already as a child, the thing is, I've had quite a challenging childhood with, for example, I had a lot of brain surgeries because I had some tumors in my ear. And what actually happened was that my writing helped me to cope with that. So I still remember that I was in my hospital bed and I was there in the hospital. But in my fantasy, I was in the outside world because I was writing my stories. And that helped me. And it was even at one point in my life, I was very desperate. And at some point in my life, of course, having had all those childhood, very traumatic experiences, I was like, at one point I was standing on a bridge and I was looking at some water. I was like, how would it be like to actually drown myself? And then I was like, come on, Joel, no, absolutely not. Because writing is important and I want to have books published. That's a reason to live. And absolutely, it has been worth more than to actually continue. But I think that a lot of us have been at crossroads in our lives where we are like, why would I keep going, even in all this suffering?
Yeah.
And even though I already had it as a kid, those experiences were always a kid. And I already had like a sense of like, this is what drives my life. But a sense of meaning is not only a negative thing. And sometimes people, they think that meaning in life, it is just a distraction of suffering. No. So meaning is not only a negative motivation, it can become meaningful inherently in itself. Like, for example, for me, writing, I don't need it now. I still, to some extent, when I'm still in a stress or whatever, when I go back to my writing, it's still a good distraction. I'm not gonna deny. Yeah. It's also a driver. It's a pull in my life. And I think that this is what a lot of people can recognize for themselves when you look at what's important for you in your life. Yeah, so I think that this is very much where I've always had this very strong sense of meaning. And then throughout my life, I've always been surprised how other people don't really have that. So that's why I started to study psychology, philosophy, and now I've become like a kind of a world-leading author and researcher on meaning in life, actually. Because I'm so surprised how people have different senses of meaning, or not the sense of meaning at all. How people are struggling with that. One of the stories that also have driven me in my journey, and which now kind of, I'm reflecting a lot on that now during my midlife, possibly even my kind of midlife crisis, to say it a little bit dramatic. But it's one of my memories when I was, I think, 18, 19 years old. So I just started studying psychology or philosophy. And I had this interview that I did with this older man. And he told me, Joel, please promise me that you will not get stuck in your life. And he told me his life story. He said, well, Joel, when I was your age, I fell in love. And then I got some children. But to be able to pay them and give them a good house, I had to have a good house. But to have that, I needed a good mortgage. To have a good mortgage, I needed to have a good job. But to have a good job, I needed to work many hours. But then I worked for so many hours that I couldn't see my kids. I couldn't go on holiday. I couldn't explore life. I was stuck. And then suddenly I got retired before I knew. And my energy is gone. My health is gone. Yes, I can still not travel a bit. All my children, they have now flown out. But I don't have the same energy or drive anymore. So it's like, I feel guilty. I've not used opportunities that I've had in my life. And this is a story that really stuck with me. Mm-hmm. And this has been a driver since I was 18 or 19 years old. So where I was aware of, like, I don't want to waste my time. I don't want to get stuck. And now I'm in midlife and I'm reflecting back on my own stories, my story of how as a child, how I already had writing as a sense of strong of meaning, which helped me through hardships. But I also have this story. And I'm now looking at myself like, am I stuck? Yes, I do have a mortgage. Yes, I am already working at the same employer for quite a while. And I realize in my job, possibly I'm doing a lot of stuff that are meaningful, but also a lot of stuff that's not meaningful. Like as a university lecturer, possibly most of my time I'm doing admin. And I'm like, why am I doing that? So, of course, I started to question all the things. all the stories that I had in my life are coming back. And this is the point where I am now at, and in my personal life. And this is where I now go back to a certain researcher who's done a lot of research on meaning in life. And he has said some very wise things about that, apparently. And the person happens to be me, myself. So I'm going back to myself, asking myself, like, hey, Joel, the expert, what would you advise me to Joel, the person who lives in your daily life, trying to make sense of this thing called life?
Definitely. I think it's really interesting that your first memory was a story, because I feel like that's an important part of how we make meaning. We tell stories about ourselves. And I really enjoyed reading in your work the different ways that people construct meaning. And so could you talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. I often use the word approach, like how do we approach meaning in life? And by the word approach, it's just saying in what ways do we find out what life is about and how we live a meaningful life? Because our teachers, they teach us how to write, and our parents, they teach us how to behave, but who is teaching us or telling us how to live? So this thing I've always been fascinated about. So I've literally traveled all over the world. I've been in many different places, and I've mainly been fascinated by meeting people, for example, in some tribes where I was the first Western person who they actually met. And then speaking with them and getting inspired and letting all my own assumptions getting undermined by their wisdom and their ways of living, that I'm thinking, why? Why have I developed my sense of meaning in the way how I've done that? Why is that? And is my way of doing things actually the best? I'm not sure. So then I started doing more research on those questions, and I think we're going to talk more about that later in this podcast. But just to say that there are three main ways or three main approaches to how people find meaning in life. In the first place, a lot of people, they use their tradition to find out what life is about. So we talk about religion. We talk about following social expectations. Or, for example, in the Middle Ages, people were relegated to a certain position in society. Like, for example, if you are born a peasant, you will become a peasant. And your sense of meaning in life would be about being a peasant. So that's a more traditional way of kind of following the expectations. Then around this 15, 16, 1700, we had the Enlightenment, we had the Renaissance. And for the first time in history, people started to ask themselves the personal question, what is my meaning in life? So this question we ask nowadays about what's my meaning in life, that question is only 300 or 400 years old. We think it's a question people have asked all the time. No, because traditionally, we didn't have to ask that question because it was given. And so asking this personal question, that is a product of a modern time. Yes, of course, we've always had some authors who were in a very privileged position, usually elderly white men who had a lot of servants and slaves helping them. People like, for example, the philosopher Plato or the ancient Greek or the ancient Egyptians. But those people, or Cicero, people like those, they were privileged men. And whereas like ordinary people didn't ask us questions. And that's what happened in like 1700. And people started to ask us questions. But as you know, at the same time, when also people started to live in cities more, people became more educated, things like that. Also in the period, there was the idea about, very optimistic about human beings, but human beings were being seen as a machine that can be controlled. There's also the idea about life, that life is like a machine. So this is it's not a traditional approach to life, but it's a mechanistic approach to life. Or I sometimes describe it as a functionalistic approach, because I'm seeing it almost as a kind of a mathematical function, where like if you do A, you do B, and then the outcome is a meaningful life. And that is, we developed this way of looking at life. And very much idea we can control things. Like I set out my own life goals, and I'm going to try to strive towards them in the most linear way possible. However, that's often not how life goes. As we often find out. We get frustrated, etc. But this is like the dominant approach in neoliberal Western countries nowadays. So we have a traditional approach, we have this mechanistic approach, and then there's a third one. And I described it as a critical intuitive approach, or also called like a phenomenological approach for the people who are more philosophically oriented. But this is about listening in a critical way to our own intuition. So we know that already a lot from the more mystic traditions, etc. But nowadays, There's also more intention for that outside of any spiritual or religious tradition, such as, for example, mindfulness, meditation, where you learn to listen to your gut feeling. You go inside yourself and you ask yourself, what is it deep inside myself, that inner voice that's telling me this is important for me? And of course, at the same time, it's important to remain critical so that we're not, because an intuition that can easily be swayed or it can be confused with still some of the traditions, etc. But if we're critically and listen to our intuition, that can tell us a lot. And what I've then found out is that, so as I've already said, those mechanistic approach to life are dominant in more capitalist Western cultures, but they're also associated with a worse mental and physical well-being. Same as a traditional approach to life is also associated with not the best mental or physical health. Whereas this critical intuitive approach is associated with a better mental and physical health. We also see this critical intuitive approach, yes, particularly in some more Western countries, it's coming up more and more nowadays. But it's more traditionally seen, for example, in Southeast Asia. When I traveled a lot in several African countries, I saw the same approach much more dominant. So this is already like one kind of key takeaway for your own listeners. Like, of course, any approach to life, I'm not imposing anything. I'm not saying that anything is bad. But if you want to explore something that maybe may give a sense of true satisfaction or fulfillment in life, I think it's about take your own intuition serious and listen critically to it.
Hey there, listeners. I wanted to take a moment to express my deep gratitude for listening and for your support. Today, I'm asking for a quick favor that won't cost you anything but would be very valuable to me, and that is, leave me a review. Positive reviews will help other like-minded Gen Xers find the show and join our community. These reviews are also a big encouragement to me to continue to develop the show and create helpful episodes for you. So thanks for sending a review my way, and thanks for being a part of the Gen X Mindscape community. Yeah, I love that perspective. So can you talk about different research findings in terms of the universal meaning typologies?
Yes. So I've already spoken a little bit about the different approaches that people have to life, but what is also really interesting is to have a look at, okay, what is it where people actually find their meaning in life? What are examples of meaning in life? Because this all still sounds a bit abstract. So what is it actually that people say is meaningful? So undoubtedly, when you go into any of the bookstores in wherever you live, you'll see bookshelves full of books about how to live life. They give you a lot of examples, a lot of stories about what's meaningful. But most of those books, most of those self-help books, they come from a specific angle. And they tell what's meaningful for those authors. However, I'm a very curious person and I'm a scientist. So as being a social scientist, a researcher, I want to know, like, what do people say across the globe? What's meaningful? So what I've done is I summarized all the studies that have ever been conducted, any surveys, any questionnaires in which people were asked about what's meaningful, important, or valuable for you in life. So I collected 107 studies, which in total had more than 45,000 participants, and which I then later translated also into a questionnaire. And again, I was able to kind of validate and confirm those findings. But all those answers from all those 45,000 people, I summarized those into some categories and subcategories. And I call these a universal types of meaning. Because surprisingly enough, or actually not surprising, it seems that all those types and subtypes of meaning, you can find them across the globe. We think that different cultures are very different. We often think we're unique. We're not. There are very universal mechanisms, or mechanisms is maybe a bad word, but universal patterns in what we see as meaningful in life. So there's 6, and I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to give you a very brief summary of those. So the first types of meanings are about what I describe as materialistic types of meaning. So these are about the type of, for example, possessions or any kind of professional success or having success in getting a degree. So it's anything more visible and material. Then there are hedonistic types of meanings. So that is finding meaning in like enjoying life, in embodied experiences, such as, for example, fun, leisure, going out for a drink and going to the cinema, reading a book, but also about being healthy, engaging in sports, sex, being in nature. So anything that's embodied and about enjoyment. Then there are self-oriented types of meanings, which is about the value of the self. So that's about developing yourself, autonomy, self-acceptance, self-care, expressing yourself, developing self-insight, going on a self-journey, possibly also also about being resilient and having a sense of perseverance, taking pride in yourself that you are able to get through difficult periods in your life. So that's about the self. So these are materialistic, hedonistic, and self-oriented types of meanings that we are very used to those in our Western neoliberal countries, where they seem to be some of the most common types of meanings. At least when we listen to any of the commercials or when we watch any television, that's what we often see. Whereas like when you travel a little bit abroad, you'll very quickly see that for a lot of people, there's more than that. And so when I traveled across the globe, I've seen that for a lot of people, the things that we see as so meaningful are not that meaningful. For example, there's myth of the pyramid of Maslow. It's the idea that first you need to fulfill all your materialistic needs, etc., before you can fulfill and reach your potential. That's nonsense. There's no empirical evidence for that. It's not evidence-based. That's a myth that has been told by gurus in businesses and companies. And that's being told in all the self-development courses. Everyone is telling you that. And look at any books from people like, for example, Stephen Covey. They will totally confirm the stories, which are not true. I'm very harsh on that. Yes, they may be true if these are your values. Fair enough, if that's how you find your meaning in life. When you really look at it across the globe, there's more than this. So what are the other types of meanings then that I found in my research? These are the social types of meanings. And that's the value of being connected, being part of a community, but also helping others, altruism, giving birth, looking after your children, or trying to make the world a better place for the next generations, looking after also older people, partners, family life. But then we also have larger types of meanings, which even go a step further. So that is more about people. Some people have a sense of a specific life purpose. For example, for myself, one of my life purposes is doing more research on meaning in life and helping others to live a more meaningful life. And particularly by writing, obviously. That's such a specific purpose in my life that I cannot reduce it to any of those other types. And then there's also personal growth. And it's also trying to make the world a better place, a larger sense of ethics, of justice. We see that a lot in the young generation who are really fighting against climate change, against social justice. It's those examples. But also a sense of spirituality, a connectedness with the world, with humanity, with nature, with religion, with spirituality. And then there are also some existential philosophical types of meanings, which are more abstract. We may talk about that later, but that's usually a bit more later in life. And these are things that people say, for example, that they find meaning in the fact that they are alive. Gratitude for being alive, sense of uniqueness, sense of responsibility, stuff like that. So more abstract. And so in sum, what we see is that these are 6 types of meaning in life and 29 subtypes of meaning that I've sneaked through in my very brief summary here. But we see that in the West, we focus on materialistic, hedonistic, and self-oriented types of meanings. And of course, they still may give you some sense of satisfaction and some sense of happiness. But that happiness is usually more superficial, more short-lived. And usually when we come at this point in midlife, we start to realize, well, I've been focusing possibly a little bit too much on that. And this is not really what gives me full satisfaction or fulfillment in life. There's more to that. Mm-hmm. And that's of course because social and larger types of meanings. Researchers show that gives you a much deeper sense of fulfillment and is much, much better for mental and physical health. And so that is already also very relevant for the people listening to your podcast. Like, whereas they may be at a crossroads, considering like, okay, what's meaningful for me? And as I'm saying, like all those examples, all of them can give some sense of meaning and satisfaction. And I'm not saying that anything is bad. But I would say, if you can do anything, try to focus mainly on getting some social and larger types of meanings in your life. So try to look at how can you help other people? How can you belong to a community, possibly a family? How can you try to make the world a better place? Ethics. possibly connecting a sense of connection and also sense of temporality of like knowing where we are, where you are in your life. So things like that, they are really important and helpful for us.
It's really helpful in clarifying and thinking about the different typologies. It sounds like it's a developmental process that many of us go through, and it's continuing to evolve. Can you talk a little bit more about how individuals develop their sense of meanings over the lifespan, and particularly for those of us in midlife?
Yes. So our sense of meaning is something that evolves, precisely as you're saying. And quite often when people talk about meaning in life, they have the idea as if it is one specific entity, like almost like the absolute meaning of life. But I'm always saying that that is a topic that we should only leave to people like, for example, Monty Python, who have made a movie about the meaning of life and also ridiculing that full concept that there's one absolute meaning in life that is given, that's there, that's universal. What we know from research is precisely as I've already described, is that different people experience different meanings, but also within our own life, it also evolves. It is also a psychological experience that changes. And when I look at this, I really like your invitation for this podcast to really also look at the research, what is really saying about this evolution of meaning during our own lifespan. And what I would say is like, the big question is like, why does meaning change over our lifespan? Why does it not stay the same? I think that there are multiple reasons for that, but I have to come back all the time to what Viktor Frankl, one of my big source of inspiration, the psychiatrist who wrote the amazing book, Man's Search for Meaning, about his experiences of living a meaningful life, even in a concentration camp, how his sense of meaning helped him through the concentration camp. But what he said is that even in a concentration camp, the worst place where you would say, how can you talk about meaning in life in a concentration camp? He said, even there, people had a will to meaning. That is the word he used. And what he means by that is like people have a curiosity about life. We want to live and we want to explore life as much as it can. It's almost like an inborn curiosity. And possibly I'm going to tell later a little bit more in a conversation about how it's almost evolutionary, how already animals have the sense of wanting to live and explore what's there. So I think we have this curiosity of life, trying to see everything that's out there. However, sometimes our curiosity gets suppressed or oppressed. For example, due to early life traumas, having had a very oppressive upbringing or an oppressive religious context like a cult or even like a culture or a country that's oppressing us. And so due to that, different people may have different developments across the lifespan. So when I'm now going to talk about some stereotypic patterns that may not apply to everyone. But usually what we often see is that in early life, a lot of people have this traditional approach that I was talking about before. So we follow the expectations from others. We take over the meanings from our parents. So I know the name of your podcast. We're talking also about Generation X. So when Generation X, when we were young, let's have a look at our parents. So the meanings that they had in their life was often about a bit more religion, a lot of social expectations, conformism. So they had like a post-war working hard mentality, that the more baby boom generation. So that's what we were told. This is what life is about. And so of course, as a kid, what do? The only thing you know, you take that over. So you think that is what life is about. So our approach to life is quite traditional, and our tradition was often telling about those things that are a bit materialistic, bit kind of also focusing on like community, on this perspective on religion, the perspective on making sure that other people do not think bad about you, things like that. That's very much when we grow up. However, if we now jump to the current young Generation Y, Z, millennials, however you want to call the younger generations, is they start to rebel against almost like how we were taught and how we grew up. So because we felt restricted quite often in our upbringing. So what do we do with our children? We would tell them, well, I'm not imposing my tradition onto you. You can develop your own sense of meaning in your life. Follow your own dreams, become who you want. But then the children are like, okay, but what is that then? Because to some extent, it's helpful if you have some examples from your parents. And the thing is, like, it's called Generation X. And when Douglas Coupland wrote his famous book about Generation X, he actually, like, the word X, it means, like, on the one hand, it's an openness. We're not predefined. That is good. But at the same time, it also implies an emptiness. Like, there's not a tradition or anything that is prescribed. So our children, the younger generation, they are like, how do we do this? So it almost brings like a terror of freedom. So we see that the way how the traditions that they grew up with are very different than the traditions we grew up with. So that's about the early life. What happens then in our teenage years or when we become in our 20s? What happens then? Because we start to fly away from under the wings from our parents or caregivers. What do we do then? Of course, then we have like, okay, these are the traditions, but there's more to life. And this comes back, I think, to the drive or to the will to live, as Viktor Frankl was already saying, like, we want to explore life, whatever life brings. And that's a natural evolutionary curiosity. And when, of course, then we start to look at, okay, this is what the parents taught, but is there more to that? So, of course, we start to look around. And because our parents, they were so much drilling on to us about the importance of the social and larger types of meanings. So, of course, what Generation X then did is they became very materialistic, hedonistic, think about self-development. So the stereotype, I'm always thinking about the books from an author such as, for example, when I talk about Michel Houellebecq, who is a French author, very, very controversial, because he has some very weird political views. But his books, they grasp this sense of emptiness. Same as Dr. Coupland in his book on Generation X. Same as that, where people explore life, travel far, and just have fun and develop yourself, go to any kind of guru farms and or spiritual farms, etc. Great. And that's what people often do in the teenage years, in the 20s, possibly still early 30s. And often that is because we explore things that we didn't get from the tradition, that we didn't get from our upbringing, because we want to find out what's life about. Whereas, like, again, when we now look at the younger generations, what they do, they've seen this, how we've been doing this, and they're like, oh man, those materialistic or hedonistic stuff and that all the focus on the self. Is that it? So what the young generation now is doing, they focus on the more social and larger types of meanings. Rarely in history have so many people been involved in social movements. Never. This is unique. We think it was the 60s. No, it's nowadays. And mainly young people. This is that sense of that awareness of the focus on social and larger types of meanings. So these are our teenage years, 20s, beginning 30s. But then, and now we're getting into slowly the midlife. Because what's happening then? Because at the end of our 20s or something like that, then we start to develop certain habits, certain patterns. We think about, okay, this is what we want our life to be about. Sometimes still rebelling against our parents or what our tradition had given us. We're still exploring that. But we then go on to that. And of course, whatever we try out, it can become like a pattern, a habit. So, and at one point, some people may settle down with a family, with a partner, with kids, a certain job. Other people, they may find a habit or a pattern in traveling across the globe and refusing a family. That can become a pattern or a cycle in itself. And that can all be fine. And that can be very meaningful. However, in our 30s or 40s, we've often been living life in a certain way for a while. And we've been trying it out, experimenting. And we start to reflect, is this it? And yes, possibly we conclude, yes, this is it. The family, my job, this is it. This is life. Fine. And you affirm yourself and you continue as happy as you are. However, sometimes we start to wonder, like, is that it? Really? And that's where sometimes some people get into like a midlife crisis, or they start to ask the bigger questions. Do I want to go into a different direction? And so we again go back then to that curiosity that we had as a teenager. However, when we get into our 30s or 40s, we are not the same as a teenager anymore. And being now myself in my midlife, I'm still struggling to admit that my energy levels are not the same anymore. My body is starting to, sounds horrible, but starts to fall apart to some extent. I don't like to admit that, but it's the case. So I also need to have a little bit of a grief or a mourning, a kind of bereavement over the fact that I had certain dreams as a kid, or when I was young, I still had the idea that I could change the politics and possibly get involved in politics as an example. I can't. Yes, I can join a protest movement or whatever, but I won't be able to really do that because I didn't go for a political career as an example. I didn't. So I need to come to terms with that I don't have the same opportunities anymore as I had as a kid or as a teenager. It's also a loss of a naivety that not everything is possible in life because, of course, where we don't know life as a kid or as a teenager, we have naive ideas. And I've now become more in touch with what's real, what's feasible, and what's not. And then another very important topic, and we often don't like to talk about that, and we must. And that's why I'm bringing it up, is we become aware of death. That sounds heavy, but it's in the midlife that we become aware. Our parents start to die, at least grandparents, possibly even some of our friends or even a partner. It's coming closer. And that is scary. That's very scary. Because as I've already told, we have this evolutionary will to live. We don't want to die. So how do we do this? How do we cope with this? And then often in response to that, in our midlife, when we are becoming more aware of our finitude, then we are like, oh, if I don't have so much time to live anymore, okay, I need to grasp all the opportunities I still have. And we have the sense of existential urgency to now make the most of life as we can. And then sometimes you see in this midlife that people start to, almost in an artificial way, try to get the most out of life. Try out all the things that they've not done. And in a very short period, try to get everything out of life. And so people then can get into like a crisis, like a manifest crisis that's very obvious, but sometimes also more subtle, more under the skin, more under the surface. And I like terror management theory because that is like talking about how do we cope with death. So have a look at terror management theory for people interested. Just Google that. And particularly the book Worm at the Core is a very good book about that. What terror management theory is saying is like there's 3 ways we can cope with death and how we can find meaning in that context, still despite our finitude. In the first way, we can try to deny our death. And for example, pretending to be young and saying, no, I'm invulnerable and I'm fine. And I avoid big questions and becoming a workaholic or being addicted to Netflix. And then there are people who have a more long-term or like a more rigid form of denial. For example, also in a positive way of like wanting to leave a legacy, looking after your children. Or in my case, I don't have children, but I write my books. That's my drive because I hope to overcome my finitude. I hope to prevent that people forget about me by writing books, by even podcasts. And so it also involves, and this is a thing we also know, rigid conservatism or toxic masculinity. That some people, that can be a response to death and to a response. And we know those people. We know the names of like people like, for example, also people like, for example, Jordan Peterson and many others who stand for a more conservative perspective on life. And if that's your thing, it's your thing. But at the same time, there's a little bit about the rigidity. I mean, we know from research how people fall back to a more conservative way of living life in response to being afraid of death. And so then there is a third way. So I'm saying like we can have this more superficial way of denial and a more structural way to deny or cope with our death. And then what we can also do is to be honest about it and say, well, I'm just honest about the fact that I'm dying, that my life is short, that I'm a mortal being. And I'm trying to be authentic towards myself and others. And so I often describe this as a double awareness. I'm aware of my limits, but I'm aware of my opportunities and see what can I do within my degrees of freedom? What can I do within this limited period of my life? How can I still make the most out of it with this realistic sense that I've developed in my midlife? And how can I do this? And I can do that by, as I've already spoken about, by reflecting on the tradition that I grew up with. And also think about what's possibly also something good about it and not all negative. But also I need to give up that mechanistic illusion that I can set life goals and realize them in a linear way possible. That's not how life completely works. And mainly it is at midlife that we need to start to listen to our critical intuition, as I've already said before. So it's about mindfulness, some looking at our inner journey and possibly looking at our shadow, as Carl Gustav Jung calls that, but also being self-compassionate towards who we are and our flaws. And very often, as I've already said, at this point, we also start to realize that materialistic, yes, that they are okay, but they're not truly fulfilling. And start focusing on like the legacy I want to live, that I want to leave, something bigger, the social, larger connections. And then in the last stage that may come after the midlife. So if we use our midlife to come to terms to some extent with death, although we never can can completely come to terms with that, I think. But a little bit more. And also giving up on some of the mechanistic perspectives, the more superficial types of meanings. When we so we become more in touch with certain things, use a more critical, intuitive approach, etc. Where are we going from there? So then, in the next years that are going to come, and we know that when we're in the midlife, possibly already, some of our kids have already left our nest. So if you have children, you may suffer from an empty nest syndrome, as they call that. So, and children give a very important sense of social meaning in your life, and that's beautiful. And it gives a sense of a larger meaning of wanting to help the next generations leave a better world. Sometimes we start then to ask ourselves a very honest question: why did I really have children? Was it really wanting to leave something behind, or was it more almost like a narcissistic self-defense mechanism to overcome my own fear of death? Like my idea that I'm a mortal being, I will die, and I want to have something left behind, preferably like a copy of me. And we maybe come to terms that possibly there was a little bit narcissism, a little bit of selfishness in that. How do we come to terms with that? And also, like, why did I put my children in this world where there's a huge climate crisis, cost of living crisis, wars that are going on in the world? How do I deal with that? And what can I still do in my limited time to make things better as much as we can? So also I start then, usually in that stage, also that we start to look at, like, okay, our children, they looked up to us, and they expected us to be an adult or grown up, pretending that we know how to do life. But then when we don't need to have that role anymore, we start to think, yes, for my children, I pretended I knew how to do this thing called life, but do I actually know? And we often just find things out on the go. We don't know. We were not born with like instruction manual given at birth. Like, this is what life is about. We don't know. So we're confronted with that again, and in our midlife and after midlife. And so then we continue, and the big questions come up again when we retire, and when we're confronted with our physical limitations, when we get ill, when we develop illnesses, which are unavoidable when you get older, when you develop cancer or cardiovascular disease or COVID. But then again, what all my research is showing, or not only mine, I'm mainly like summarizing, reviewing a lot of research from others, and they show time and time again how a sense of meaning helps us to cope precisely with those limitations that we're then confronted with. It helps you to cope with death. It helps us to cope with the limitation of our body. It gives us a meaning, a purpose to get through. In the same way as I already told as a kid, how my sense of meaning that I found in writing helped me through my horror. The same way it will do that again when we are older and we get confronted with those things. And then when we near our death, we need to really become more in touch with taking stock and looking back, like, okay, have I really lived my life in the way how I wanted? And take stock of the positive things, but also come in touch and be honest about our guilt, our regret. Like the story of that older man who told me, like, I got sucked into a habit, a pattern, and I regret that I've not lived life to the full. We need to come to touch with that. So how do we deal with that existential crisis at the end of our life? So this is in a nutshell, or actually not so much in a nutshell, but like how meaning evolves over our lives, I would say.
Thanks so much for joining me today for part 1 of my conversation with Dr. Joel Vos. I hope his perspectives and his work have given you some valuable insights for your own journey through midlife, and I just really appreciate you listening today. It's really a joy to share these discussions, and I'm sending my best to each and every one of you. I hope you'll join me for part 2 of my conversation with Joel, where we'll continue to explore purpose, meaning, and midlife. So until next time, keep exploring, stay curious, and stay true to yourself. Hey there, listeners. I just wanted to take a moment to express my heartfelt gratitude for listening to this podcast. Your support and feedback keep me motivated to continue growing and crafting episodes that are meaningful and helpful for you on your journey. That's why I'm inviting you to join our Gen X Mindscape community page on Facebook. It's a great space to share your feedback on the show, suggest future episode topics, or simply connect with fellow listeners. Also, don't hesitate to leave me a voice message over at genxmindscape.com by clicking on Leave a Voice Message at the top of the page. Whether you choose to remain anonymous or provide your name and email, it's entirely up to you. Once again, thanks so much for listening. I'm definitely looking forward to hearing from you.